First, we're going to stitch our gathering stitches around the top and the bottom of the sleeve, and you're going to pull a tail out, threads long. This is a long stitch on the seam line from dot to dot. Out and leave a tail. Okay, and our next line is going between the stitching and the edge, doing 2 rows of gathering stitches. Tail. Okay, and now we're going to do the bottom of the sleeve. Tail and one more on the bottom. And there we have our gathering stitches on the top and the bottom of the sleeve. And now we're going to take our sleeve band and you're going to fold over 1/4 of an inch on the unnotched edge and iron it down so you have a nice crease in there. And then we're going to turn it over and we're going to pin lower part of the sleeve onto the sleeve band, and we're going to match up these notches. The other side. And we're going to pull the threads from both directions into the middle until we have a good fit. And we're going to even these out. When you tie these off, we're going to tie them off. We're going to bring the bottom threads to the top. When you pull on the top one, it pops the bottom one up so you can kind of get a hold of it and pull it through. And then we'll tie them all together. To even out the stitches so it fits the band. And just kind of even them out. And then I'm going to tie the other side. Bring the threads up. And I'm going to tie them off. Okay, I'm going to finish pinning this till it fits. There. And now we're going to sew it. On the stitch line. And we're going to stitch it right on that gathering line that was stitched on this sewing line. Making sure that the pleats or the gathers are laying flat. is sewn on the bottom. And we're going to trim off the threads for the gathering at the bottom, not the top. At the bottom, we're going to trim off all the threads for the bottom. Now that we have our armbands sewn on, we're going to trim this seam. We're going to take off about half of the seam allowance on the armband. Okay, and we're going to cut off the notches. Now you're going to pull the band forward and iron it. I kind of give it a little bit of a finger iron here so we nice and flat, and then we'll take it over to the ironing board and we'll iron that nice and flat, and the seam is toward the band. The first thing we're going to do to set the sleeve in is stay stitch around the armholes on the bodice. Stay stitching, and you're going to repeat that for the bodice and the linings. Now we have all of our stay stitching done. We are going to clip the armholes about every half an inch. All the way around to the stay stitch line. And you're going to repeat this for the bodice and the linings. So now we have our armholes clipped. We're going to pin the sleeve to the armhole, leaving the lining free. And the single notch at the top of the sleeve will line up with the shoulder seam. And this is right sides together. And we're just going to pin the areas that are not gathered. And then we will gather it to fit. now we're just going to pull these threads to gather this up on this side. Okay, gather it till it fits. And then we're going to tie this side off. I'm going to pull the back threads up. And then tie it off. And then you're going to even out those pleats or gathers. Make them nice and even on the one side. And then we'll pin it down. And we're going to do the other side. Okay. Pull it to fit. And then we're going to tie it off. Then we're going to even out the gathers and pin it. Now we're going to sew the sleeve on, and when you're sewing on anything that has gathers, make sure you stitch on the gathered side to keep the gathers nice and flat when you're sewing over them. So now we're going to trim all of our threads and repeat it from the other for the other side. Now our sleeves are sewn in. We're going to trim the seam. On the bodice side, we're going to cut that seam off about halfway so it lays nice and flat. And we're going to cut off the notches. And you're going to repeat that for the other sleeve. So now we're going to fold the seam up toward the bodice. And we're going to give that a little finger press. Kind of keep it in place, and then we're going to come back and we're actually going to iron that. We're just using the tip of the iron. And we're going to repeat that for the other side. Now our sleeve seam is ironed. We're going to go back to the lining and we're going to turn up 1/4 of an inch on the lining, and we're going to iron it in. Just going to crease it, so then later on when we turn that up, the crease will already be there, so we can pin the lining around the seam. Easier to crease it before you put the underarm seam in. And now we're going to repeat that for the other side. Now we're going to work on the underarm seams, and you're going to fold the sleeve, the bodice, and the band right sides together, and you're going to pin this matching the sleeve seam and the band seam, and you're going to pull the hem in the band up, and you're going to stitch that side seam, underarm seam all the way through the band. And we're going to repeat that for the other side, and the seam will be ironed open. So you're going to open the seam up and iron it nice and flat. Okay, so our side seam and underarm seam are done, and the little part right here that is the underarm seam on the sleeve is actually going to be exposed. So in order to finish that seam, we're going to take a little bit of fray block and put it right on the edge of that seam on both sides, and that way we can iron that seam open and have it finished so it doesn't ravel. And you'll repeat that for the other side. Now we're going to iron the underarm seam. Put that on the ironing board. And we're going to iron this open. Then you're going to turn back up the 1/4 inch on the sleeve band and iron it back in place. And we're going to repeat that for the other side. Now we're going to sew the underarm seam on the lining. So right sides together, we're going to fold this. And we're going to pin the underarm seam. We're going to fold out that 1/4 inch, and we'll refold it after we're sewing this. We sew the seam. And then you're going to iron this open and repeat it for the other side. So now we're going to stitch the lining to the armhole, and you can see my sleeve is still wrong side out. We're going to put the sleeve through the lining and then we're going to turn up that 1/4 of an inch that we ironed down and we're going to pin that right along the seam line there, and that encloses that armhole seam. And we're going to continue to do that all the way around. And then repeat for the other side. Now we have our linings pinned on. We're going to hand stitch the lining to the sleeve. And you only need to take a little bit on the sleeve seam and then come up and about a 1/4 of an inch away from your other stitch. The stitches are about a 1/4 of an inch away. Just take your little stitch right at the seam line and not on the sleeve itself. And you're going to continue that all the way around and do for both armholes.